Welcome everyone to this Majlis today, and it's really a great joy to introduce to some of you Austin. Many of you probably know him, and I hope for those of you who are new to the Majlis, this will be a first occasion, not a unique and only occasion to join us. And also, I don't know, do you have this expression in English that library love? So when two people meet in a library and then fall in love and marry. So I saw this happening. Well, this came to my mind today or in the previous days when thinking about how to introduce Austin. That's our friendship is a Majlis friendship, because I first met Austin in these majlises, what he came to attend, and he always asked his insightful, brilliant questions, and also there was also our common friend Kamran Talatov, who wrote to me and recommended Austin. And then I think we already agreed that he will have a majlis with us when we met in person in Yerevan. And then I heard his talk, and then I said, okay, that was a right choice, surely. And then we also visited some of these magnificent Armenian churches together. So we have beautiful shared memories, and we will have one more beautiful shared memory starting now. I'm really keen to hear about his journey and then his research. Austin, please entertain us.
Yes, great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. As I know, in the spirit of the Majlis, we talk a bit about how we came to this subject of study. And I should say that really what I'm going to describe my field, I usually describe it as sort of pre-modern Persian literature or classical Persian literature. And of course, my book, which came out last year, is on ʿAṭṭār, on ʿAṭṭār's Masnavis in particular, but I have pretty broad interests, and I've also worked on Abu Sa'id al-ṭayr and the Asra al-Tawheed and Khayyam. I have a project right now on spurious and misattributed texts and the kinds of notions of authorship that are helping these things be created, which I'm very interested in. But I think, like most of us, I came to this very circuitously. It's certainly not something I sort of thought I'd end up doing and didn't really discover until later in life in many ways. I think in many ways, I mean, the story sort of starts when I went to college, and I got my BA from the University of Chicago. And in high school, I didn't, I think I was sort of I was a smart kid, I guess, and sort of high achieving maybe, but I thought I wanted to be like in the sciences or physics or math or something. I went to University of Chicago, and I think I got like a C in my first math course. I thought maybe I don't want to do math anymore. That's the negative aspect of it. But the positive aspect of it was I was in a history course that I was really taken with, and I hadn't actually. I realized I hadn't really sort of studied history before I went to college. I had gone to a very large public high school in Minnesota, which is where I was from. And it was a fine school, and the teachers did their best. But history was sort of just sort of reading from a single textbook that we had, and it just sort of described what happened. And you would just sort of read it, and you just kind of memorize it, and then you would select the correct answers on multiple choice exams. So when I arrived at University of Chicago, and I took a class on sort of Western civilization, and it was the first time I had sort of read a historical source and realized that sort of knowledge, humanistic knowledge or historical knowledge isn't something that's already sort of preformed for the taking, but is, something that's sort of constructed through an interpretive hermeneutics, through reaching out and engaging with a text. And that was very exciting to me, very, very exciting. And I think sort of being exposed to sort of doing history, like actually doing the history, right? Doing history, not at a very high level, of course, but in working with sources, and they were all translated into English, of course. But that was a new experience for me, and it was really, really exciting. So that's the positive aspect. The negative aspect was realizing maybe I wasn't so good at math. But the positive aspect was I discovered this other thing that was really exciting. And in fact, just going to college, I think I sort of became aware that I became aware how knowledge was constructed, right? And that it can be constructed in different ways. I mean, I think before I went to college, I thought there were sort of 6 branches of knowledge. You had your math and your science and your English and your social studies, basically all the classes that I was taking every year in high school. And when I went to university and I saw, wow, there's so many, there's so many different ways to think about things and so many different ways of avenues and disciplines of investigation that I hadn't even been aware of, and they all have their own histories and their own genealogies. And so that was very, very invigorating. I think part of the story here too. So at the University of Chicago at that time, and I think still to an extent, although they've maybe addressed this in some ways. So everyone had to take these sort of core classes, and they were very much in the like great books kind of mold, quite Eurocentric. So the course I was taking was called European Civilization, and a lot of this is very Straussian. That there's these sort of great books, and they have these secret messages, and we can all learn something by engaging with them. And the authors are all sort of who you'd expect they were. And so I think even as a somewhat naive 19-year-old, though, I sort of sensed there was something uncomfortable about the Eurocentricism of these courses, even though I was loving them so much, right? I was loving engaging with the history, but I still felt like, I don't know, like a class on European civilization, like what is being left out here? And I actually remember we had a short little lecture on sort of the caliphate. And I remember we talked about like the Umayyads and the Abbasids in like 2 sentences. But I remember that being like, wow, I want to learn more about, like these other areas that I certainly didn't learn about in high school. And I sort of sensed that something was being left out of the story in college, even without knowing that much. And so, by the end of my first year, I was really interested in doing something more humanistic, right? I was very interested in history, but I was also interested in trying to do something that wasn't just sort of European history or American history. And this was also in the post, 9/11 era. This was 2003. And so Arabic was sort of very visible on campus, I think, as a language people were learning. And it's not that, I wanted to be in part of the security apparatus or diplomat or anything like that. But I think it was just very visible, right, as a sort of non-European language, maybe in the same way that, Russian was very visible in the Cold War. So I ended up enrolling in Arabic, basically just because I had a roommate who was taking it, and became very interested in Middle Eastern history. And that's sort of where it started. But of course, you're still learning things. I became somewhat more interested in, I started taking Persian my last year of college, mostly because I thought this is pretty cool. I'd like to keep doing this. And, I sort of heard you needed 2 Middle Eastern languages to, in graduate school, you would have to learn 2. And so I sort of started taking Persian sort of on a whim, really, thinking, well, I better take, I could either take Persian or Turkish. And Turkish didn't work with my schedule, so I thought, oh, I'll take Persian. That might be fun. But of course, Persian is, takes a lifetime to master, if you ever do master it. But the learning curve is certainly not as steep as Arabic, and you can get pretty good results, in just a couple of months of study if you're a native English speaker, especially if you know some Arabic vocabulary. So I was, and also I think I was more mature. I had sort of learned some techniques for language learning. But the result is that my Persian became many times better than my Arabic, which I had been studying for 3 years in the course of about, 3 or 4 months. And also there were some other students who were quite interested in it. I was very interested to learn. I never had learned, partly because of the way it was taught and partly because of the way I practice. But with my Arabic, I never learned to really speak at all or have a conversation. And I didn't want that to happen with Persian, and there were some other motivated students. So we would have lunch sort of twice a week and only speak Persian, another American student. But we were doing that from, 2 months of study onwards. And it really helped me a lot. And so I was really excited to sort of use this language and to speak this language. And so when I went to graduate school, I wrote a sort of BA thesis on the Armenian silk trade in Safavid Iran. And so I was sort of thinking of doing this sort of economic history of sort of early modern Iran. I'd read the works of Willem Floor and Rudy Mate, and I was quite interested in that kind of research. And that's really what I applied to study in graduate school. And I stayed at University of Chicago for graduate school. That's where I did my PhD. And I think my motivation really in going to graduate school at that time was really I wanted to keep learning the languages, right? And I wanted to keep practicing my Persian and my Arabic too, but especially Persian. I wanted to find a way to keep doing that, and that's really what sort of motivated me. I think was I wanted to get really good at Persian and read historical sources in Persian. But my interest sort of changed again. I think as my Persian kept getting better and better, and I found I could actually read literary texts and poetic texts. At first, there's a stage where you might read a line of Molana or Senai, and you're like, okay, I understand every word in this line, but I have no idea what the line is saying. And then once I got past that, I could sort of start putting things together and learn the conventions and the tropes. I became very, very, very interested in the more literary side of things. And one of the nice things about an area studies department, I was in the Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations department, so you sort of have the freedom to kind of move between disciplines, sort of historical disciplines and literary disciplines, much more freely than you would, if I had been admitted through the history department. I wouldn't have been able to do that. But because I was in an area studies department, I could move from this more sort of historically focused study that I had originally imagined myself doing to really something quite different, right? From sort of Safavid economic history to pre-Mongol poetry and mystical poetry. And part of that too was, I think, the sort of influence of Franklin Lewis, who ended up being my advisor and mentor. And he was just such a kind and gentle soul, and I really enjoyed all of the courses and classes I had with him, and sort of kept taking his courses. And unsurprisingly, my interests sort of came to match his own in many ways. So that's sort of how I, got into it. It's, again, like most people, it's not like I woke up one day and thought, oh yes, I'm going to study, Persian mystical poetry. It was sort of a long, somewhat circuitous route, and there were different things I dabbled in before I ended up where I did. And it's not just the result of my own interests. I think it's also very much the result of the people who were around me and their interests and mentors' interests, the influence of Frank, certainly, that helped me come to this. the way I came to sort of my dissertation, so it was really, I think I was looking for a way to do. I was interested in mystical poetry and Sufi poetry, but I didn't want to just do a kind of sort of what is the theology in this poetry, or like what is the sort of mystical psychology in it, right? I didn't want to approach the poems just as sort of conveyances or vehicles for some kind of meaning that one might find in a prose treatise or explain in another way, which is sometimes the way it's approached. I mean, I think that that's certainly fine and has its place, but I was interested in thinking about sort of the kinds of relationships people develop with poetry a little bit more, and what does it mean to engage with something poetically. And that's really the sort of question that motivated the dissertation in a lot of ways. So I became very interested in sort of like Pierre Hadot and like his idea of sort of philosophy as a way of life, and thinking about different kinds of philosophical texts and as sort of indicating a broader kind of lifestyle that moves beyond the text, and thinking about reading as a sort of spiritual practice or spiritual exercise. That was really quite influential for me. I became really interested in thinking about how texts sort of rhetorically construct relationships between readers, real or imagined, right? And persona within the text, and what that can tell us about the act of reading or the experience of reading. I also became very interested in thinking about how there might be different kinds of poetics that are sort of implicit in these texts that never get explicitly theorized in philosophical texts or rhetorical texts. So, you know, a text like Shams al-Qais, the famous rhetorician, or Giorgiani's Asrar al-Balagha, you know, there's a lot of work on in the pre-modern period thinking about how lyrics work in ta'jib, right, and this sort of creation of a feeling of wonder. But the theorists and the rhetoricians and the philosophers didn't really consider didactic poetry in the same way, right? Usually it was focused on sort of lyric or panegyric, and very much focused on metaphor, and not really thinking about narrative, which of course is something very critical to the didactic masnavi. So, you know, I was thinking about, you know, what is it that narrative does? Why is narrative a useful way to teach? And also thinking about different ways that a kind of poetics might be implicit in didactic poetry. So one thing I became very interested in is this metaphor of speech as medicine, which shows up in ʿAṭṭār's poetry all the time. And of course, his pen name ʿAṭṭār is sort of the perfumist, but also the druggist, right? You know, and ʿAṭṭār is someone who can compound medicines. And this is a metaphor that runs throughout really his entire world, thinking about speech in poems as a kind of taryaq, right? A kind of antidote for different kinds of religious malaise or sickness. And he'll describe his own poetry in a lot of ways as sort of acting on the listener or the hearer in the same way that a medicine does. And in fact, you don't even have to understand it for it to act on you, he says, in the same way that a patient doesn't need to know what a medicine is or how it works for it to have an effect on them. So that was quite interesting for me, and I'm always very interested in ways that people talk about poetry within poems themselves, and how that might elucidate a kind of horizon of expectations in which people are approaching poetry, and also that poets are manipulating to try and elicit certain kinds of reactions that isn't necessarily apparent in the philosophical works. So those were the sorts of themes that were very much in the dissertation. And again, it goes back to trying to find a way to approach this poetry that goes just beyond sort of what does it say, right? What is it saying in terms of philosophical content or theological content, and thinking more about sort of what does it do in a sort of performative way. And that very much, the book is very much a sort of much more refined version of that. book came out of the dissertation, but I was revising it for like 5 years. And same kinds of ideas and same kinds of arguments, but I think much more convincingly stated and much more refined. So if you're going to read one, definitely read the book. But I guess that probably goes without saying to most people's advice. But it is very, I mean, its concerns are very much the dissertation's concerns. Yeah, so that's essentially an overview of my story. I hope that provides some background, or maybe useful for someone who's at a particular stage in that process as well. I don't know if anyone has any questions about that. I'd certainly be happy to answer them if they do.
If you have questions, please, it is all right to ask it now. We will have a question and answer session later, but that won't be recorded. So if you want,
however you like to do it, I'm fine.
No, I mean, if you have something which you think the reply will be such that well, you want it in the recorded session, then ask it please now. Well, I will ask something which I can ask probably everyone who is our guest and also who are attending these majlises. And it just came to my mind now when you were talking about your journey starting with mathematics. That how did you imagine your future, and how did you consider the realities of life when doing your study, and that doing mathematics and science would be probably a much safer option, or anything would be a much safer option than doing mystical poetry, studying mystical poetry, and it's medicine.
No,
it's
I
medicine
didn't,
instead
alas.
of. So
yeah,
how this whirlpool works?
You know,
How does
when
this
I was an
work?
yeah, I think when I was an undergrad, I was not particularly pragmatic. I mean, I think I always had an idea that academia was an option. I don't think I understood how the realities of the job market at any point really in that journey until the last few years. Yeah. But at the same time, I think I was not, you know, I wasn't particularly concerned about majoring in one thing or another. I mean, at one point, I even thought like, oh, maybe I'll major in sort of Eastern languages and civilizations, but I could still do like a sort of business career or something. You know, I didn't feel like I had to sort of, I felt like I had the freedom, and maybe this is less true now. I felt like I had the freedom to sort of major in whatever I want, but I could take the sort of necessary courses to get a job in a particular field. I know a lot of people were doing it. So when I was an undergrad, a lot of people were majoring in history or something, but they would go and like work for banks or something, or in finance. But I mean, that career never really attracted me. But yeah, I wasn't particularly pragmatic, but I also didn't feel a pressure to like major in something to get a particular kind of job. I felt like, you know, people were like majoring in all sorts of things and going to law school, for instance. These days, I think people are less willing, you know, they say, well, if I major in this, what's the job opportunity going to be? At least at that point, I felt like the major was more of a sort of what you're interested in, but didn't really dictate what your career would be. I think it's different now, or it's perceived differently now.
Yeah, probably it's not that different now, but there is a pressure on students to think it is different. But yeah, that's what we say to each of our students now, that, well, if you have such a degree in Persian or Arabic, or then any employer will know that you are special. So that's and yeah, well, so basically you just went with the flow of the passion, and then you always knew that
Yes.
if the best possibility doesn't happen, then you will have a plan. You will find out a plan B.
Well, yeah, I mean, it became scarier as it approached the end, and I thought, oh, I need to figure this out. I mean, I got very lucky at the end, and that I did get a job. Yeah, I don't think I understood how difficult it was until I was at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the great thing is that you tried what you most
Yes.
liked, and you are there.
And it worked out.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes, so many people don't even try. And then, well, thank you, Austin. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So,
unless someone has a question now. Okay, let's go ahead and save the questions for after the formal part of the talk.
Okay, so I think that should be visible, yes? The PowerPoint. Is the PowerPoint visible? Yeah? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so most of you probably know somewhat who ʻAṭṭār is. He's this famous mystical Sufi poet who probably died in the Mongol invasions in the 1220s in Nishapur. And without a doubt, ʻAṭṭār's most famous work today is The Conference of the Birds. Since 1863, it's been translated multiple times into European languages, and it has recently inspired 2 original illustrated books as well as multiple stage performances. It is also easily ʻAṭṭār's most studied work. Its academic and non-academic popularity is largely due to its allegorical frame tale, which is commonly summarized in this way. A hoopoe leads a group of birds on a dangerous journey towards their king, the Simorgh, who resides on Manṭeq at the edge of the world. To arrive there, they must journey through 7 valleys. Many of the birds perish along the way, and when they finally encounter the Simorgh, only 30 of them are left alive. When those 30 remaining birds gaze on the Simorgh, they are astonished to see themselves reflected in the Simorgh, and the Simorgh reflected in themselves. They are ontologically linked to the Simorgh, who nevertheless remains utterly transcendent. In this way, they experience effacement in the divine, Fenā, which is encapsulated in the poem's central pun on 30 birds, Simorgh and Simorgh. The poem is thus an allegory of the Sufi path, in which the birds symbolize Sufi seekers, the Hoopoe, their peer, and the Simorgh, God. This summary, however, corresponds only to a portion of the frame tale. Before the birds actually set out on the quest, they voice objections and concerns about the proposed journey, which the Hoopoe proceeds to demolish. They then ask a series of questions about spiritual virtues and vices, to which the Hoopoe responds in the fashion of a preacher delivering a homiletic assembly. These are more than brief preliminaries introducing the quest. In fact, the Hoopoe's homiletic performances are, in many ways, the heart of the Masnavi. They represent the vast majority of the poem, approximately 88% of its total length. And it is through these performances, the contents of which are recapitulated by ʻAṭṭār for the benefit of his readers, that the birds are rendered fit for their journey. Only at the very end of the poem do they actually set out on the path towards the Simorgh, and the events of the journey are only briefly alluded to before their final admission to the divine presence. This is not to deny the importance of the birds' allegorical journey or the significance of their final climactic encounter with the Simorgh. Rather, it is to place that climactic scene in context and to recognize that most of the poem's content is devoted to the homiletic speech that motivates the journey and which makes that final encounter possible. The poem is thus not just the story of an allegorical journey towards God through 7 valleys. It is the story of a series of homiletic performances that prepare, instigate, and serve as a vehicle for that journey. In this way, the Conference of the Birds can be read as a narrative demonstration of the perlocutionary power of homiletic speech, in particular, its ability to motivate spiritual reform and push listeners forward on the mystical path. This valorization of homiletic speech is not disinterested, however. The text is composed of the very same mode of discourse whose efficacy it strives to demonstrate. To read the Conference of the Birds is to place oneself on the receiving end of the Hoopoe's exhortations and admonishments. So the poem's framing of the latter's rhetorical power is critical to the transformative work that it aspires to perform. The present talk, based on an abbreviated version of the 4th chapter of my book, investigates how homiletic speech and its perlocutionary effects are portrayed in the Conference of the Birds. It begins by reconstructing, insofar as possible, the practices and procedures of preaching in ʿAṭṭār's time, which provide the context for the Hoopoe's performance. It then turns to the frame tale structure, which allows ʿAṭṭār to construct an imagined performance setting with an embodied speaker and reactive audience for the sermons and anecdotes typical of the genre. He can thus narrate the effects of the Hoopoe's speech, which is ultimately his own speech, on the fictive audience of birds, showing how it counters their doubts, inflames their passion for God, and ultimately convinces them to set out on the spiritual path. In the book, I go on to examine the changing nature of speech once the birds reach the court of the Simorgh, where identities and hierarchies dissolve, reference prove elusive, and speech, if it is to be any use at all, must be elusive and oblique. And unfortunately, we don't have time for that today, but you can check it out in the book. Ultimately, though, I argue that the Conference of the Birds is fundamentally a tale about speech, its power, and its limits. The Hoopoe's oratory provokes a journey towards an ineffable God who cannot be grasped in language. Homiletic utterances act on readers and listeners, pushing them towards a realm that speech itself can never fully capture. So, the conventions of popular preaching, the sort of majlis-e vaz, of course, varied across time and space and social setting. And because the tradition was predominantly an oral one, it is difficult to reconstruct. Nevertheless, by triangulating references in different classes of sources, we can deduce some of the common features of homiletic practice as it was performed and imagined to have been performed in the Eastern Islamic world during the Seljuk and Mongol periods. First, some textual works purport to preserve the actual content of specific homiletic performances. For example, the assemblies attributed to Rumi, Saadi, Simnani, and Nizam al-Din Awliya. These are probably not accurate transcriptions, however, but edited accounts set down at a later date, or even literary idealizations of how such events were imagined to have unfolded. Still, they give some indication of a homiletic assembly's expected contours. Also useful for reconstructing homiletic practice are hagiographies and travel accounts, which more directly capture the context and nonverbal aspects of the sermon. Finally, normative accounts of preaching, especially Ibn al-Jawzi's manual on the subject and al-Ghazali's discussions of preaching in the Ihya, are invaluable for reconstructing the horizon of expectations against which ʿAṭṭār's idealized accounts of preaching made meaning. As portrayed in these sources, homiletic assemblies could take place in a variety of settings: in mosques, madrasas, and khanaqahs, or their attached courtyards, in shrines and cemeteries, or when the session was sponsored by a private donor, in the courtyard of a palace or residence. Preachers like Ibn al-Jawzi and Ahmed Ghazali could attract huge crowds, and the Hoopoe's assembly is hyperbolically described as consisting of 100,000 attendees. The preacher would usually ascend a pulpit or other platform, especially in these larger gatherings, increasing his visibility and marking him as a spiritual authority. He would generally sit, a standing posture being reserved for the formal, liturgically mandated Friday sermon. According to Ibn al-Jawzi, the preacher should open the session with praise of God and Quranic recitation, performed either by himself or by a professional reciter, muqri. The traveler Ibn Jubair, who attended 3 of Ibn al-Jawzi's sermons in Baghdad, describes 20 reciters sitting before the famous preacher, chanting in rounds. The recitation is then followed by a eulogy for the Prophet, a prayer for the reigning caliph and his subjects, and what Ibn al-Jawzi calls a khutbah, a benediction of rhymed prose in praise of God, usually climaxing in a Quranic phrase or verse. The Quranic recitation and rhyming khutbah endow the performance with a ritual quality and cultivate a sense of pious awe and wonder, encouraging audience attention and receptivity to the sermon proper, vaz, which tends to be more discursive and didactic than the opening material. It should, according to Ibn al-Jawzi, consist of Quranic exegesis along with related exhortations to pious behavior and stories of pious men. Hikayat al-Salihin. As for specific vocal and bodily techniques, the preacher might emphasize certain points by striking the pulpit with a sword or staff, his traditional accoutrements. Such an action, quote, arouses the hearts of the people and prepares them to snatch up exhortations avidly, unquote. Tone and modulation were important as well. Ibn al-Jawzi recommends, quote, raising the voice and displaying zeal in warning and exhortation, unquote. And he cites a hadith that the Prophet would visibly display excitement while preaching, and his eyes would become bloodshot. According to Ibn Jubayr's travel account, Ibn al-Jawzi reacted visibly and emotionally to his own material from the pulpit in a way that increased its rhetorical effect. So he writes, emotion visibly overtook him, Ibn al-Jawzi, when he's preaching, and tears prevented him from speaking, so that we feared lest he would choke. Then suddenly he got up from his seat and descended from the minbar, and having installed fear into the hearts of those present, he left them as though on burning coals. They followed him with tears of agitation, some weeping profusely and some rolling in the dust. Some preachers would even apply, allegedly, a salve of mustard seed and vinegar under the eyes to produce tears on demand. Such behavior is harshly criticized on the grounds of its insincerity, but it nevertheless demonstrates how preachers sought to trigger effective responses in their audience through their own nonverbal emotional displays. By its very nature, oral homily presupposes a circumambulant actuality, in Walter Ong's terminology, in which the audience and preacher are present in the same space over the course of the performance and are thus capable of reacting to and influencing each other. The audience's participation was not only possible, but encouraged. Indeed, it was a central component of the performance. Listeners would intervene by posing questions and voicing objections, and they would register the effect of the preacher's words through bodily displays. For example, during particularly intense moments of admonishment, some listeners would raise their hands upwards to signal their engagement and approval with the material. Displays of extreme affect, including weeping, fainting, and ecstatic movements were common, if contested, modes of audience response. Weeping is portrayed as a frequent occurrence in the assemblies, especially when preachers admonish listeners to consider their own sins and reminded them of the terrible fate in store for those who violate God's law. Ecstatic behavior, badged or wajed, is also reported, similar to that which occurred in Sufi Sema ceremonies. Attendees would allegedly flail about, striking each other and themselves, and sometimes even ripping off their clothing. Some were said to fall down in swoons and even die. These intense displays of affect were a focus of much scholarly debate. In general, Ibn al-Jawzi did not approve of them, not because he thought the audience should remain unmoved by the preacher, but because he worried that these particular practices were often feigned and insincere, and that ecstatic movements could lead to a potentially lascivious mingling of the sexes. He does not condemn them absolutely, but he suggests that in most cases they are to be discouraged. On the question of crying or weeping, Ghazali is more permissive, allowing it on the part of both the preacher and the audience. Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, the grandson of Ibn al-Jawzi, considered the audience's weeping to be a sign of a sermon's efficacy, and he boasts of his own ability to reduce great men to tears in his preaching. In any case, despite scholarly debates over their legitimacy, these practices appear to have been widespread. According to Ibn Jubayr, the assemblies of Ibn al-Jawzi were full of weeping and ecstatic displays, even though the latter opposed such behavior in his prescriptive writings. Through these displays, as well as more subtle cues, the audience could not only demonstrate their attention and receptivity to the material, or lack thereof, but also influence how the sermon unfolded. Most sermons were semi-improvised events, so a skilled preacher could pick up on the audience's expectations and reactions and adjust his performance accordingly. This dynamic has been well documented by ethnographers in modern oral performance settings, and while our own pre-modern sources are much more reticent on such matters, they do hint at the extent to which audience reaction shaped the course of a homiletic assembly. For example, the Sufi preacher Abu Sa'id is said to have been able to intuitively sense when a listener was struggling with a particular concept and immediately clarify his position with an apt verse or anecdote. And I love this quotation from Asra Tawhid, the hagiography written about Abu Sa'id's feats. It says the sheikh would speak at an assembly every day, and whenever a concern would pass through someone's heart, he would turn to them in the middle of his discourse and respond to whatever was in their heart with an allusion, rams, a verse, bait, or a narrative, hikayat, in such a way that they would understand. And this quotation is taken from Ibn Monovar's hagiographer, Asra al-Tawhid, which often ascribes the sheikh's perceptiveness on such matters to a miraculous preternatural intuition, firasat, it's made into a sort of miracle. But these abilities can also be interpreted in a more sober fashion as the knack of an expert orator and teacher for identifying resistant or confused listeners on the basis of bodily cues and adjusting the performance accordingly. And I think many of us are teachers, and I think we can identify with that. Audiences could also influence the course of the homily in a more direct fashion by asking questions, and numerous anecdotes attest to its interactive dialectical character. The ideal structure of a large public sermon, as sort of imagined and prescriptively described by Ibn al-Jawzi, includes a section devoted exclusively to audience questions. According to Ibn Jubair, the majority of Ibn al-Jawzi's sessions were spent answering questions posed verbally or, interestingly, passed to him in the form of notes. Such works such as Rumi's Fihi Mafi and the Fawaid al-Fu'ad, which purport to record more intimate homiletic sessions, also include frequent questions and interjections from the audience. These texts may be literary constructions designed to evoke oral homiletics more than records of actual events, but they still show the general form that such assemblies were imagined to take. The conventions of preaching, including mounting the pulpit, the opening of Quranic recitation, the queries from the audience, and the latter's wailing and ecstasy, are incorporated into the Hoopoe's performance in the Conference of the Birds, which is thereby cast as an idealized homiletic assembly. This performance setting runs throughout almost the entire poem, but it is most obviously encapsulated in a passage immediately after the birds agree to journey towards the Simorgh. Although amenable to the journey in principle, they confess that they remain mired in confusion, which must first be resolved because, quote, this path cannot be trod in ignorance, unquote. After casting lots to choose a leader, they invite the Hoopoe to ascend the pulpit as their imam of tightening and loosening so that they might be prepared for the way. The Hoopoe complies with their requests and ascends the pulpit to conduct his assembly. Then the Hoopoe made the preliminaries for the speech. He ascended the pulpit and began. When the crowned Hoopoe sat on his throne, whoever saw his face found high fortune. The troop of birds formed ranks, shoulder to shoulder, more than 100,000 before the Hoopoe. The nightingale and turtle dove came forward together so that they might together serve as Qur'an reciters. They chanted such melodies then that the world was thrown by them into a tumult. As for those whose ears were struck by their melody, agitated they came, stupefied they left. An ecstatic state came over everyone. None were with themselves nor without. Then the Hoopoe began his homily. He withdrew the veil from the face of meaning. So the Hoopoe first ascends the pulpit, the kursi, and he begins the preliminaries. By virtue of the crown of feathers on his head, he's likened to a king on his throne, taht, bestowing fortune on those who approach him. It might be useful here to recall Becker's very old argument that at the dawn of Islam, the pulpit functioned not only as a platform for oratory, but as a sort of metaphorical throne for the prophet. If we understand the Hoopoe to be sitting on the throne, which seems reasonable, that would also indicate that this is a hortatory assembly and not the liturgically mandated Friday sermon, during which the preacher would traditionally stand. Before the Hoopoe begins the homily proper, the nightingale and turtle dove, both renowned for their beautiful voices, play the role of Qur'an reciter, or muqri. More specifically, they chant melodies, or alhan, a particular style of recitation that was sometimes criticized for being too close to secular singing. Ibn al-Jawzi, for instance, fiercely attacks it, writing that melodious recitation, quote, pleases and stirs human nature, and thereby diverts people from contemplating the Quran itself, unquote. As we have seen, Quranic recitation could sometimes trigger ecstatic states in its listeners, which was a source of religious anxiety for more sober critics, who worried that these behaviors were insincere affectations. And the birds behave in precisely this way. The melodious recitations of the nightingale and turtle dove throw them into an ecstatic tumult. Compared to a live homiletic performance, literary texts are something of a one-way street, at least as far as the author's relationship to the later readers is concerned. While a preacher might respond in real time to their audiences, and a reciter might deviate from their script in response to listeners' reactions, ʿAṭṭār composes his poetry, at least in part, for an anonymous textual readership that he will never meet. Literary communication with these anonymous readers necessarily lacks the circumambulent actuality of oral homiletics and thus their dialogical character. Through the frame tale, however, ʿAṭṭār manages to mimic within the text itself something of the interactive, circumambient performance and reception environment that literary authorial communication is otherwise denied. The birds not only react to the Hoopoe's sermons with extreme displays of affect, but, as we shall see, actually steer the direction of the performance through their questions and objections consistent with non-literary homiletic performance, which is here being evoked. So the frame tale of the Conference of the Birds can sort of be heuristically divided into four main sections. And these are not something you're going to find sort of paratextually labeled in the text. They're something that I'm putting on the text, but I think it's useful for sort of not getting lost. And in the first section, the birds are introduced, and the Hoopoe urges them to seek the Simorgh. One by one, they present their excuses, which the Hoopoe counters with exhortations and illustrative anecdotes, right? So it's basically discourse, right? It's an account of the Hoopoe's discourse with the birds. In the second section, the Hoopoe mounts the pulpit and continues his assembly, answering specific questions about the way. So again, the second section is again all discourse. The birds haven't even set out yet. In the third, the Hoopoe discourses on the 7 valleys, describing each of them before launching into a thematically related set of anecdotes and homilies. So again, we're still talking here in the third section. In the last section, the birds finally set out, and ʿAṭṭār provides a brief narration of their journey, followed by their encounter with the Simorgh. And this is actually the shortest of the 4 sections, when the journey actually begins. Even before reading a single verse of these exchanges, the poem's title hints at the importance it attaches to languages in general and homiletic utterance in particular. Titles were notoriously fluid in the medieval period, and the poem circulated under several names in the manuscript tradition, including Manṭeq al-ṭayr, Conference of the Birds, ṭayr, Spiritual Stages of the Birds, and the ṭayr nome, the Book of the Birds. All 3 of these titles, however, can be traced back to how ʿAṭṭār himself describes the work, and they are all somehow related to speech. The first 2, found in a single verse in the poem's conclusion, might not have been intended as titles really, but as references to the events of the frame tale more generally. So he writes that the Conference of the Birds and the Spiritual Stages of the Birds have found their completion in you, O ʿAṭṭār, like light in the sun. Regarding the former, the Arabic root nun, ta, qaf encompasses a semantic field related to language and meaning. Manṭeq is usually translated as speech, language, or logic, but also oration, whence the poem's common English title, Conference of the Birds. The phrase also alludes to Solomon, who, according to the Quran, was taught the language of the birds, or Manṭeq al-ṭayr. Not only could he perceive the significance in what others mistakenly believed to be meaningless chirping, but he was able to use this knowledge to command an avian host and dispatch the birds and dispatch the Hoopoe to the Queen of Sheba as a messenger. Consistent with Solomon's image as a sorcerer, prophet, king, the phrase is endowed with theurgic overtones. The second expression from this quotation, ṭayr, is usually translated as spiritual stages of the birds, and ʿAṭṭār also uses this expression as one of the poem's proper titles in his introduction to the Mukhtar nome. In technical Sufi terminology, a stage, or maqam, refers to one of the psycho-ethical waypoints along the Sufi path towards the divine, and the 7 valleys traversed by the birds can easily be read allegorically as such a sequence of mystical stages. Yet there is notable polysemy here. Maqamat is also the plural of maqama, which signifies the place in which one stands to deliver a discourse, especially a homiletic one, and by way of metonymy, the homily itself. It is used in this sense in the picaresque Mohammed genre, in which eloquent rogue heroes repeatedly dazzle audiences with their oratory in a variety of locales. The Mohammed Tuyur, then, could also be translated as homilies of the birds, a rather apt title given the bulk of the poem's content. Finally, yet another title is suggested in the prologue to the Mukhtarnameh, where ʿAṭṭār enumerates his previous works. The particular title given here is rather generic, the Tuyurnameh, or Book of the Birds, but it is praised in terms drawn from the conceptual field of language and coupled with a Persian calque of the Arabic Manṭeq al-ṭayr. So he writes praising his prior works. He praises all of them here, including the Manṭeq al-ṭayr. And about the Manṭeq al-ṭayr, he says, the language of the birds, Zeban Morghan, of the Tuyurnameh has transported rational, nāṭiq, souls to the site of unveiling Kash. So the work is thus cast as a transformative utterance that gives rational, literally speaking, nāṭiq, souls access to knowledge inspired directly from God. In contrast to the Musibat-nameh, which features a pedagogical discussion between a Sufi sheikh and a single disciple, the Conference of the Birds depicts a much larger homiletic performance for a multitude of seekers. The journey towards the Simorgh and the discourses that motivate it are a group affair. After the customary doxologies, ʿAṭṭār's narratorial voice welcomes various birds one by one onto the field of action, including a parrot, peacock, eagle, pheasant, and falcon, among others. The various fowl then assemble themselves into a group, a jam, majma', and observe that every city and clime, except for their own, is ruled by a king. Without a king, they complain, there can be no order or arrangement in the army, nor can they progress further along the way. In this manner, they quote, they all arrive at one conclusion, unquote. They must seek out a king for themselves too. The bird's quest is thus, from the very beginning, an explicitly social undertaking. The birds commit to seek out their ruler not as individuals, but a group. A ruler is necessary precisely because they are bound together by social ties. They constitute a city or shah, and therefore need a monarch, shahyar. Although the birds decide to set out jointly, their endeavor is profoundly hierarchical. Immediately after they settle on the search for their king, the Hoopoe emerges as their de facto leader on the quest. He recounts his bona fides as Solomon's companion, and he tells the birds he already knows the identity of their lord, the fabled Simorgh, and he claims to be uniquely positioned to guide them towards its royal court. So already we can discern the asymmetrical pedagogical axis that will structure most of the remainder of the poem. The Hoopoe must continuously prod his resistant and fickle flock to move forward. Only at the end of the tale, when they enter the court of the Simorgh, does that hierarchy dissolve. At the same time, even though the Hoopoe stands above his fellow birds, he does not stand apart from them. He is an integral member of the group. As he confesses in his opening speech, he has traveled much and knows the identity of their king, but he cannot make the journey alone. The quest for the Simorgh is a social, dialectical project undertaken collaboratively by both teachers and students. The Simorgh has its origins in pre-Islamic Iranian mythology, but it remained a resonant cultural symbol even after the Islamization of Iran. In early New Persian literature, it is famously found in the Shahnameh, where it is endowed with a variety of magical powers, especially healing, and nurtures and protects the hero Zal after he is abandoned as a newborn. In the following centuries, the Simorgh and similar mythical birds were incorporated into Islamic mystical and philosophical writings, where they were often associated with Gabriel, the Holy Spirit, and the active intellect. It appears, for example, in Sohrawardi's Safir Simorgh, or the Simorgh's Cry, where it calls a Hoopoe upward towards unification with itself. It's very interesting. We get a Hoopoe there as well. The allegorical Treatise of the Birds by Ibn Sina explores similar themes. It is the story of a bird, told in the first person, who is freed from the nets of terrestrial hunters by his avian brothers who had already escaped. Although no longer captives, bits of cord remain bound to their feet that hobble them slightly. Together, they journey across 8 mountains to the summit of a 9th, the residence of the Supreme King. Although not explicitly identified as the Simorgh, the king's mountainous perch certainly recalls that of the mythological fowl. Ahmad Ghazali later composed his own rendition of the treatise, in which a group of birds journey to the island of their avian king. His version exists in both Arabic and Persian. The bird's monarch is a phoenix and a ghaw in the former, and a Simorgh in the latter. Many of the birds perish along the way, and when they finally arrive, they are denied entry because their king, in his complete self-sufficiency, has no need of their devotion or love. They are admitted through his grace only when they realize the futility of their own action and his ultimate independence from them. ʿAṭṭār's frame tale seems to be based primarily on Ahmad Ghazali's version, but it also includes elements from Ibn Sina's treatise as well as his own innovations. As in Ghazali's telling, many birds in the conference of the birds perish along the way, and they are initially rebuffed by the Simorgh's chamberlain of glory before being admitted by the chamberlain of grace. But like Ibn Sina's birds, their journey is also a sequential quest to the mountainous home of their king through a symbolically significant number of stages. Here, 7 valleys instead of 9 mountains. The play on 30 birds, Simorgh and Simorgh, seems to be ʿAṭṭār's own invention, by means of which he explores the disintegration of identities at the moment of effacement or fana. Ibn Sina's treatise can be read as an allegorical Neoplatonic ascent from concrete sensory particulars towards the active intellect or beyond, while Ghazali's version of the narrative emphasizes the necessity of grace to reach the divine beloved. ʿAṭṭār's Conference of the Birds incorporates elements from both of these, but it is also run through with specifically Sufi concerns, especially the interior connection between the self and God. In addition to its particular theological vision, the Conference of the Birds also represents a striking formal deviation from these earlier works. The standalone allegorical narrative of the birds has here been reworked into a frame tale structure. The figure of the guide is completely absent from Ghazali's treatise. While the avian protagonist in Ibn Sina's version is shown the way by others, they are not granted extensive speaking time. In the Conference of the Birds, by contrast, the majority of the story is given over to the Hoopoe's hypodiegetic or embedded performances. In the first section of the poem, the Hoopoe meets the excuses of specific birds, starting with the nightingale, who, in accordance with its conventional characteristics in Persian poetry, proclaims the rose his sole object of desire. Why search for the Simorgh, he asks, when this rose suffices? Why endure ascetic deprivations, ibargi, when he could dally with his beloved, adorned with 100 petals, barg? The Hoopoe responds critically, accusing the nightingale of falling prey to the superficial charms of an inappropriate beloved. The Hoopoe said to him, "O you who are mired in form, don't boast of your love for a flirt. Love for a rose face has brought nothing but thorns. She really has done a number on you. Although the rose is lovely, in only a week her beauty begins to fade. Love of something that decays vexes those who are wise. Although the rose's smile gets you going, she throws you into plaintive singing day and night. Pass by the rose. For every new spring, the rose laughs at you, not for you. Have some shame. Although the rose is beautiful, her beauty is temporally bounded. Born of contingency, she is destined to wither within a week, and it is the height of folly to love something so ephemeral. According to the Hoopoe, her smile, a conventional metaphor for the opening rosebud, is in fact a mocking grin as she laughs at the nightingale's foolishness. For all these reasons, the Hoopoe castigates the nightingale, asking whether he has any shame, and exhorting him to, quote, pass by the rose, unquote, as the Simorgh, and towards the Simorgh, who is the only object truly worthy of love. He then transitions into an illustrative narrative that concretizes this point. It tells of a dervish who falls in love with a princess, and he is encouraged in his devotion by her smile. When he persists in public professions of his love, he faces execution for this breach of decorum. Before he is killed, however, he learns that the princess's smile, like that of the rose, was one of mockery, and that all his love pains have been for naught. The Hoopoe's excoriating tone in this passage reflects the rough and tumble nature of homiletic rhetoric, as well as the power imbalance between the preacher and his audience. His address opens with the disparaging epithet, "O you who are mired in form," and he admonishes the nightingale to have some shame. Although harsh and seemingly contemptuous, such a tone is pedagogically motivated. The nightingale, like many of his avian fellows, resists a transformation that would ultimately be to his own benefit. Therefore, he must be made to see the precariousness of his current spiritual situation, and a belittling, cajoling address is, according to contemporary homiletic norms, one way to do this. Ibn al-Jawzi, for instance, would address his listeners with vocatives such as, "O you who forget," and "O you who are banished from the company of the pious." Likewise, ʿAṭṭār and Rumi routinely chastise their readers for their weakness or ignorance. These homiletic reproaches are often gendered on the basis of an assumed association between masculinity and spiritual strength and effeminacy and spiritual weakness. Thus, the wayward individual in ʿAṭṭār's poems is frequently derided as a woman or non-man, a zan or a muhannas, while the spiritual hero is praised as a marg. And in this capacity, actually, I think it's interesting to note that, sometimes we think of these mystics as being sort of ephemeral, sort of airy, sort of lovey-dovey types. But it's quite interesting that when Dawlat Shah talks about ʿAṭṭār, he describes him as, he says his sohan, his speech is the Tazianeh Ahle Saluk, the sort of whip of the people of the path, which I think gives an indication of the kind of, it's a sort of violence actually at times in this homiletic discourse, but it's bound up with this desire to sort of push people forward. In this way, the Hoopoe adopts the preacher's conventional language of rebuke in an effort to disabuse the nightingale of his foolish attachment to terrestrial beauty. Over the course of the section, he counters the objections of the nightingale and 9 other birds. For each of them, he begins a cajoling admonishment with a dismissive epithet and then narrates an illustrative anecdote. Each of these descenders embodies a particular spiritual fault on the basis of its species' conventionally understood appearance and behavior. The duck is thus portrayed as a fastidious ascetic, constantly performing ablutions. He's too concerned with purity to seek the Simorgh. The owl, known to haunt ruins associated with buried treasure, is a miser so myopically obsessed with gold that he sees no profit in a long journey. The falcon proudly serves temporal kings, and because the latter have restricted his sight with blinders and a hood, he cannot see their deficiencies in comparison with the Simorgh. The Hoopoe lambasts each of them for their spiritual weakness and exhorts them to move past such short-sighted objections. This general pattern of question and answer continues through the second section of the poem, which comprises approximately 1,500 lines, or 40% of the narrative. Unlike the Hoopoe's initial discourses, which he delivered in response to the excuses of specific birds, the questioners here are left anonymous. The Hoopoe responds to around 20 inquiries, most of which are introduced by the formula, "another said to him," or "another asked of him." Approximately the first 10 questions involve specific spiritual weaknesses. One bird admits that he is scared of death, another that he is enmeshed in earthly love, and another that he suffers from excessive pride. The Hoopoe castigates them for their failings and attempts to guide them to the straight path. Other birds inquire of the specific mystical virtues that they have already begun to develop, such as love of justice, submission to the divine will, and high mystical aspiration, or himat. These birds are met with the Hoopoe's praise. Still others ask the Hoopoe what they ought to bring to the Simorgh as a gift or boast of their exclusive focus on the divine. The Hoopoe answers each of these interlocutors with some mixture of praise and admonishment, followed by a series of illustrative anecdotes coupled with explanatory exhortations. A typical response contains around 4 or 5 of these anecdote exhortation pairs. So again, both of these sections are very much in line with what we'd expect a homiletic assembly to look like based on the other sources we have. And the poem is sort of evoking a sort of imagined homiletic context as this sort of imagined performance context of these embedded narratives here. And that tells us something about their imagined function. Now, the famous 7 valleys appear in the 3rd section of our heuristic quadripartite division of the poem. But again, the birds do not actually traverse them at this point. Instead, the Hoopoe delivers 7 sermons, one for each valley, explaining its particular significance to his avian flock. One of the best known aspects of the Conference of the Birds, these 7 valleys represent a specific ordering of the various mystical stages or maqam that, according to Sufi manuals, populate the mystical path. At each point, Sufi wayfarers are expected to master a particular virtue, state of being, or modality of experience, and only when that stage has been completely internalized under the eye of the spiritual guide can they move on to the next. The number and order of the stages varies widely between traditions, authors, and even texts, and the Conference of the Birds can by no means be taken as a sort of standard ordering of these stages, although often it is used as that, erroneously, I think. In response to a question about the route to the Simorgh, the Hoopoe explains that they will have to pass through 7 valleys: desire is seeking, talab, love, aish, gnosis, marafat, detachment, istighna, unification, tawheed, bewilderment, hayrat, and finally spiritual poverty and effacement, faqr, fana. For each valley, the Hoopoe delivers an introductory homily in which he explains the spiritual state associated with it, followed by anecdotes and further exhortations on related themes. This set of discourses comes to almost 800 verses. There is no direct narrative account of the birds traversing each of the 7 valleys at this point, or actually at any point in the poem. The names of the 7 valleys appear only in the context of the Hoopoe's homiletic speech, in which he explains the various spiritual states that they symbolize. In my experience, students and readers unaccustomed to the conventions of the didactic Masnavi are sometimes left somewhat disappointed by this aspect of the Conference of the Birds, expecting, based on how it's described in the secondary literature, a sort of dense allegorical plot akin to Spenser's Fairy Queen. Tellingly, modern adaptations of the poem almost always inflate the frame narrative while diminishing or even eliminating the embedded homiletic performances. For example, Edward Fitzgerald and Rafiq Abdullah keep the focus more directly on the story of the birds and their renderings by reducing the number, frequency, and length of the embedded narratives and sermons. In both versions, the Hoopoe generally responds to his flock's questions with a single anecdote or exhortation, instead of branching off into a full thematic chapter bound by associative logic, much like a semi-improvised sermon. More recently, The Conference of the Birds has been reimagined as an illustrated children's book by Alexis York-Lombard and a gorgeous graphic novel by Peter Cease. The Hoopoe plays a guiding and encouraging role in both of these, but he doesn't recount stories. The frame narrative has become the only narrative, and the original's focus on the transformative power of embedded homiletic performances is necessarily diminished. These modern illustrated adaptations also include many images of the birds in flight as they journey towards the Simorgh. Pre-modern illustrated manuscripts, on the other hand, generally depict the events of the embedded anecdotes. And in the rare cases that they do depict a scene from the frame tale, it is invariably that of the bird's homiletic assembly. In the famous illustrated manuscript at the Metropolitan Museum, dating from the Safavid period, the diminutive Hoopoe occupies the sort of compositional center of the poem. He's perched on a rock, like a preacher on a pulpit, while the other birds form a sort of loose ring or halqeh around him and are gazing at him. His beak is sort of partly open, as if in speech. It may not be visible through Zoom. The same scene is illustrated in the Staatsbibliothek and Czartoryski Museum manuscripts, which you can see here. In the British Museum, in the British Library composition right here, it shows the same kind of scene, but here the Hoopoe, he's standing on an elevated rock pulpit, but he's berating the Hoopoe, the peacock, as a sort of audience of one. The 1493 Bodleian manuscript contains the same scene as the Met, Staatsbibliothek, and Czartoryski manuscripts, but it includes a dazzling, multicolored Simorgh among the other birds. This one's a little more pixelated, but you can see it right here on the right-hand side. This is not, however, an illustration of their final encounter. Rather, as the painting's position in the manuscript and the accompanying paratextual header makes clear, it is another illustration of the bird's assembly, Majma' al-Tuyur. The Simorgh has been added into the scene as a creative act of interpretive illustration and painted in accordance with its appearance in the epic tradition. There's likely no single reason that can explain why this particular scene was favored by the pictorial tradition. The availability of models, anxiety about the possible theological implications of depicting the birds at the moment of union, and the illustrator's personal interest may have all played a role. Whatever the case may be, these pre-modern illustrations stand in sharp contrast to modern pictorial approaches to the work, and their presence serves to emphasize the centrality of the birds' preparatory homiletic assemblies to their journey. The Hoopoe's sermons on the 7 valleys further feed the birds' desires for the Simorgh and provide them with the final push they need to actually embark on the journey. His speech is so powerful that many die on the spot, a conventional trope of extreme audience reaction to powerful oration. Their souls became restless from these words, and many died right in that staging area. all of the birds left in that place, headed out on the road in longing. For years, they traveled high and low, a long lifetime exhausted on their way. Their journey takes years, but as to its details, ʿAṭṭār largely demurs. He explains that many perished along this way, and he lists some of the dangers they faced, including panthers on the mountaintops and excessive hunger and thirst, which can be allegorically interpreted as the hazards that await novices along the spiritual path. This passage, however, which comes to less than a dozen lines, is the extent of his direct narration about the journey. The sevenfold spiritual geography of the valleys is drawn from the Hoopoe's preparatory sermons, not through extra-diegetic narration of the journey itself, which is allegedly beyond explanation. How could any explanation answer for that which befell them on this way? If one day you come to this path, then you will see its passes one by one, and you will know what the birds experienced. It will become clear to you the blood they swallowed. For one to understand what it is actually like to make this arduous journey, one has to undertake it themselves. Thus, rather than recount this experience in detail, an impossible task in any case, ʿAṭṭār devotes the bulk of his narratorial energies within the first three sections of the poem to the didactic lessons that provoke the bird's quest and constitute its ethical core. So in the written version of this chapter, I go on and talk a bit about sort of what happens when the birds find the Simorgh and how language sort of dissolves there. But the larger point that I'm trying to make is that, if we really look at how the frame tale is structured, most of the poem is recounting these discourses. It's not actually about the journey. So I like saying it's not just the tale of a spiritual journey. It's really a tale of speech as an inducement and preparation to a spiritual journey. And that speech is being delivered in the context of, in a context that evokes sort of oral homiletics that his readers would have been very familiar with. And I think that tells us something important about what he sees this text doing for its readers, actually sort of preparing and pushing its own readers to move forward on the journey. And those are themes I explore in other parts of the book as well. So thank you so much for your attention. And I look forward to any questions anyone has or comments or thoughts. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Austin. This was magnificent. It is so nice to see someone talking about great speeches and doing it in a way that does justice to the topic. So well, I hope no one died in the audience, but I'm sure we are all very excited. It was really fascinating. Thank you very much. Before we turn to the questions, I'd like to link this Majlis to some others we had, and I will put into the chat the links for them, the recordings. So there is first, it's Hansi and Liu's Emotions in Political Thought, a late Abbasid mirror for princes by Ibn al-Jawzi, and then which was a proper Majlis. But we had also here Paul Heck, which was not a Majlis, but it is in the you can we recorded it and it's here. So we put the links here, and it was on weeping and speeches. Where is the second part of it? So I will actually write to both of them to read your book and to contact you, because I think you have a lot to share, and I recommend everyone here to see those talks as well. Yeah, and one more thing before I forget, that next week we will be still pretty much in Iran, and it would be Yusuf Ünal as Majlis with the title Our State in the End of Times, the Safavid Rule and the Shia Theory of Sovereignty. So I copied that also into the chat. And well, you can already subscribe to it, register for it, and I will also advertise it this night. So yes, I will switch off the recording, And please have your questions. I see already two hands raised, so we will be there. We will continue with the discussion. And thank you again.